Hey everyone. Like Hannah said, I'm Douglas Joerss, which is amazing. No one ever gets the last name right. I am a research scientist three at Seattle Children's Therapeutics, or formerly Seattle Children's Therapeutics, and now at BrainChild Bio. And I'm going to talk about kind of our unique journey that I've been on, but also that Hannah has accompanied me on over the past few months. So first I'll start off kind of just a history. I promise this is relevant at Seattle Children's Therapeutics. So this is our sample management history. So prior to Seattle Children's, my principal investigator, Dr. Michael Jensen, worked at the City of Hope, which is a private nonprofit clinical research center, and it was a graduate school in Duarte, California. This would be a long time ago, 2008, 2009, 10, something like that. And at the hospital, and they still use it actually, sample management was handled by a custom built software that was created by a contractor. So Dr. J reached out to someone the hospital worked with before and made a completely like unique custom software that kind of worked for them. It leveraged FileMaker Pro, which is this sort of cross-platform like relational database application. I'm not a software guy at all, but it was something that I had never heard of before. So prior to this lab, I had worked with many sample management and lab management software. So this one was new to me. So when Dr. Jensen transferred up to Seattle Children's, it was called many other things, but at this point in time, it still exists. It's called Seattle Children's Therapeutics. So this sample management software made the transition up, as you can imagine. It had all the history of registration and everything else. So we have a pretty straightforward workflow. I mean, this is not all of it. Our workflow actually continues to develop as we adjust and change and everything else. But this is like the core of it. This is most of what we do. So what we do what we did and do, and I'm just going to use those two interchangeably here, is we do CAR T cell therapy. So basically, we're generating plasmids, we're putting those into viruses. Those viruses are being transduced into cells, into T cells. Those T cells are being tested against tumor cells for a number of scientific applications that generate data and everything else. So that's kind of the backbone of our workflow and what we do. So here's just the workflow. So we'll have a lab member create a plasmid via cloning, and this will necessitate the need to generate a plasmid ID. We're generating tons and tons and tons of these all the time. So then, as I said, this plasmid is inserted into a virus, and then that virus itself, it will get its own ID generated, right? So we need to track these different plasmids and viruses as we go along. That virus goes into T cells, tumor cells. The cell ID is generated, both for T cells and for tumor cells. And then those T cells and tumor cells are co-cultured for assays, a number of different assays, and then assay data is generated from all of that. So as you can see, all of these steps in red necessitate interfacing with the sample management software and the lab management software and that kind of stuff. So that's pretty much the backbone. So I apologize. I'm about to trauma dump on all of you, as the term I believe is. So this was the challenges of the old software, and this is not the fault of the software person who made this. There was a real sort of a long-term breakdown in communication and a bunch of things that we're not going to get into. But I do want to highlight the challenges that we dealt with. So one of the limitations of the software as we were using it was there was no ability to create or track sample batches. So, if we were to use a sample, regenerate it from, scratch where we're using the same materials and all this other stuff. So it's not a different sample, it's just a different iteration. We didn't have the ability to track those sample batches. Unfortunately, we worked in research, so that wasn't like an industry need to do so, but that will come into play later. So in addition to that, we had some really light lineage tracking. So if you remember the workflow that I showed, right, like the software did track virus to plasmid to virus to cell, that kind of stuff. But to be frank, not in the way that's comprehensive and visually pleasing as LabKey is able to. The real sticking point for me with the software was the no bulk functionality, really the sample import. So this includes either multiple samples at once or multiple information fields per sample. So we were quite literally line by line entering hundreds of samples every week. It was excruciating. It was one of the things I immediately noticed when I started working here, how everybody hated it so much. So I set out on a years-long mission to sort of get rid of this software and to adopt a better one. The search functionality was quite poor. I mean, you would have to enter in the full name. There was no partial searching. There was no keyword searching. There was none of that. So it was very difficult to sort of find anything. No real audit trail. I mean, there was, but it wasn't really accessible by users. So it was very difficult to figure out if something went missing or went wrong or whatever, what happened to that. No bulk sample export, as I mentioned earlier. So there's no ability to sort of generate sample reports or the ability to, export your inventory so that you can QC it or anything like that. No batch editing. So, if you move things around or if you find you've made a mistake during import, you would have to go in one by one and do that. No mandatory sample data fields. So, scientists are excruciatingly lazy people a lot of the time. So they will sort of, if you're using a software that's not, doesn't work for you as well as it should, you're going to start taking shortcuts, right? So there was definitely some shortcuts taken in terms of what was entered. But also when you have a database that's over a decade old, right? Like you're going to have different naming conventions and those are going to drift a lot. So that was, that was definitely a struggle. And then kind of most critically here, we had a single contractor. So we basically had a single point of failure regarding support staff and a data server. So this was, one guy and, it's, you don't like to say it, but if he has like a sort of serious health problem or just decides to kind of stop doing it, right? Like you all of a sudden have to pick up and start over and scramble. So it would be disastrous to lose all of our data in this way. So the issues that it created for us, again, plasmids had our plasmids had no digital inventory. We just kind of stored them sequentially, and people took them out, didn't put them back. It became very difficult to find kind of what was going on. We had a virus inventory. It used Excel because it was just easier for the people that generated virus to use Excel. Our tumors and our T cells did use this software. So as you can see, we're the full spectrum of bad stuff going on, so to speak. As I said, the importing samples was, I'm being nice by saying it's time consuming. It was excruciating. It was very difficult to import or to QC sample inventory and move these around. No batch tracking, no area for assay data. So, we were using Windows file explorers, or file explorer folders, which is fine. But, if you ask for something that's 2, 3, 4 years old, maybe somebody has left, that becomes kind of very difficult to track down where that information is. As I mentioned, like our entire data history was in a very precarious position with a single point of failure. The search functionality led to duplication of samples. Like we would create a cell line and then, you just couldn't really search for it in that capacity. So years later, you end up making the exact same thing. This is time wasted, et cetera, et cetera. So we had to change, right? And I led this change, and this change was quite long, and it spanned many people coming and going on the project. But basically, we just evaluated several options, right? And everyone had their opinion, but the ones that we sort of settled on were the generation of sample registry. So basically, we needed a place that held static information about samples, concepts. If that's codon sequences, if it's the plasmid within a cell, all of that kind of stuff. Like, what is this? Bulk functionality is huge for me. I'm a process efficiency guy as much as I try to be. So when I see someone doing something, exporting or importing or taking forever to do something, and it can be done simpler, that's just my ears perk up, and I'm going to fix that. And then simplicity of use, right? Like, you can these softwares, you can have solutions and solutions and solutions, but they really don't matter if people don't use them, right? So what you need to do is make these as simple as possible so that people say, hey, this is actually really useful. I'm going to use this, and it's easy to use, right? So that was a big selling point for me as well. So these are the reasons that we went with LabKey. So to be frank, we had a correlative lab in house that already used LabKey, so we were kind of attracted to that. They had used it, they had success with it. Financially, it was a little easier for the lab to transition to LabKey. But we very much enjoyed sort of the list that you see here, right? So these, as I mentioned, these biological concepts as static information pages, if you want to call that registry. And then the ability to generate sample batches was critical to us, and I'll kind of get more into that in a bit. Bulk importing, audit trail, customer service availability, right? So we had one guy, he was really good at being available, but it's one person, right? So like, it's never like, oh, I was just like out running errands for the wife, right? Like sorry. You always kind of have someone available with LabKey, which we very much appreciated. And then also an ELN. We cycled through a bunch of ELN softwares, and with LabKey, we were able to fold in an electronic notebook, which, as I'm sure you all know, it leads to being able to track samples and figure out where you're going and specifically what you've used, which has been great. So the process for setting this up, we met with Hannah several times and laid out all of this to her. I think I mentioned this to her, like we were a cat and we just brought like a dead rat to her doorstep and we're like, I'm really sorry that we're doing this to you, but this is what we have. Please help us, right? So we discussed our vision with what we wanted, and then ultimately we were able to transfer our sample data exports to her. Needs that we communicated to her were, again, these static pages of registration, the bulk importing, the batch tracking, the audit trail, the lineage tracking, the support. Obviously we're transitioning and we need a bunch of technical support while we're doing it, but also beyond that, right? So we had everyone in our lab had used this old software forever. They were begrudgingly used to it. So we not only needed something new, we needed, the ability for support beyond that because we really wanted to change the lab. And then of course the ELM functionality as well. So the one thing that I do really want to shout out about this particular experience is, I mentioned I worked with several lab software management companies. This was the first time that the person that I was working with actually said, hey, give me what you got. I have the experience and I want to mock something up for you, right? This is again, for me, a unique experience at this point in time. It personally saved me quite a bit of time. I'm not, I have taken this on as like, I'm being nice, and I think this is the right thing to do. This is definitely not a part of my recurring job. But quite frankly, like Hannah's both ability and willingness to do this saved us a ton of time and basically made it possible. And in addition to that, she actually did like data cleanup, which in my opinion, whether this is true or not, this was above and beyond as a service to me, right? She went and said, hey, like these are the things I've changed. Is this correct? I want to make sure not only that the process is good, but like the data that's going in is consistent as well, so that the tool that we're providing to you works as well as possible. So that, that was a big deal. So what did this do for us? Basically, it maintained our sample concept pages, which is stuff that we've had going on for over 13 years. So we were able to retain all of our information in a much more organized and searchable fashion, right? So this just totally got rid of all of the shortcomings that we had gone through. Furthermore, it maintained the lineage, right? So lineage tracking is a huge deal in general between samples, and especially for us at each stage of the process. Those lineages look crazy because it was a raw data dump that we did. Whether or not they're right, we won't worry about that. That's not LabKey's fault. But it was amazing to see how easy it was to look through that stuff and see that it was all there. And really, it was such a comfort to visualize all of that. Again, like the import of all this sample data made it super easy to search and access our locations and our records in like a much more attractive GUI. Like the software that we had was really old. We didn't update it at all, and it was just, it worked fine in a sense, but no one wants to look at like unpleasant softwares anymore. They're easy enough to throw together. Um, so yeah, the ability to quickly import sample information and locations as they're generated. I wish everyone on this call could have seen my face, like when I just did like the first big like 100 sample batch import, and it took like 5 minutes instead of 2 hours. It was amazing. It felt very good. So able to export these sample records and locations so that we could both perform inventory QC and consolidation. And you're going to see where that comes in very handy quite shortly. It positioned our lab to import assay data and link to samples in the future within LabKey itself. So assay data is still something that we're getting into. Again, this will be revealed why. But previously there was no way. It just didn't even have that functionality. And if it did, it was not the way that LabKey can do so. So we have positioned Seattle Children's Therapeutics to be able to do that and be able to access data much more quickly, have more comprehensive data, all of that kind of stuff. And again, we're using some separately paid for ELN service to LabKey, and then this allowed us to just bring the ELN under one roof and sample linking in a notebook. It's made all of that much easier. So all of this happened, I think we made the transition in last December. So Hannah and I were talking for a few months prior to that, working on all of this. And then in December, it was revealed to me that Seattle Children's Therapeutics was spinning out a company known as BrainChild Bio. So literally, Hannah rolled all of this out, trained people, and then 1 week later found out that I was leaving the company. So two things happened. One is Hannah is still maintaining her relationship with Seattle Children's Therapeutics and seeing that through. But in addition to that, I said, hey, I have a new job. Do you want to keep helping us in a different way? So now I work for this company called BrainChild Bio, which started in early January. It's pretty much the same thing that Children's Therapeutics had been doing. We took some of the technology from it. And it's, again, a kids first clinical stage biotech company for harnessing power of CAR T-cell technology for tumors in the CNS. Again, this is the history. I gave the Dr. Jensen history earlier. We're going to continue to see that project through and go through from there. Mercifully, what this allowed us to do was completely walk away from our entire inventory for the most part and our processes and just start with a fresh slate. So basically, 1 week, I'm telling Hannah, this is great. Thank you so much. We appreciate it. I'm coming back and I'm saying, hey, let's do this for real. Like when you work with old systems and you transfer over, you sort of have to stay tied to that anchor a little bit. You have data that you have to sort of export or import, and it's messy. And this was a real opportunity to start fresh. So this time around, we basically started as fresh as possible. And what we wanted to do was really start tracking our lineage. We have donors that we generate T cells from. We hadn't previously tracked those. We split out our T cells and tumor cells into two different source types. And we really wanted to do the batch functionality. We didn't really get a chance to do that, as you can imagine, over the course of 1 week at my previous job. So source types here are defined as the registry. It's static information. Obviously, I unfortunately can't show these, but like if it's a plasmid, it's going to show the DNA sequence. If it's a tumor, it's going to show what the plasmid is in there. It's all very straightforward. And then Hannah and I worked pretty closely on this next particular subject of batches. So we really wanted to generate sample batches because now we're a GLP lab, we're for profit, we're going to be under much more intense scrutiny for the products we're making. So yeah, we generated batches within sample types. So we have aliquots as well that are derived from those batches. So that batch functionality is seen here. I'm going to rush. Sorry, I'm talking a little too much. So you can see we have a tumor line where it says TB0003. That's batch 1. We define this as a master stock. You have the aliquots of that stock beneath us. We're then able to derive batch 2, as you see there beneath all of those, from batch 1. so that now we have a working bank of tumor cells that's all tracked beneath that as well. And you see both batches and aliquots, their cells per vial, percent viability when applicable. Some of these don't have them because they're transferred from the old lab. We're tracking a passage or storage location, et cetera. So again, we generate a source concept, physical samples are generated and derived into batches. We generate aliquots from that. Then we derive additional batches from those previous batches and then generate aliquots from that. Here is the lineage of such a line. So at the top, you have your source, then you have your first batch. To the left, you have your second batch, and then you have your subsequent aliquots from there. So it's very clean, very easy to see what's going on. You can click around everywhere. It's a fantastic process for us, and we fully understand what's what and what's going on. I don't get questions anymore at all. It's fantastic. It makes my job so much easier. And the other thing here is we now have bulk aliquot importing. We utilize this Excel sheet where each group or each scientist in our group will freeze down a bunch of cells. They'll move them into LN2, and I say, hey, let's put where you moved, what they are, put them into this Excel sheet. It updates live, and then when you're done with that, at the end of the week, I basically QC the sheet. Does everything make sense? Is everything filled out as much as possible? And then I import this into LabKey. It takes me 5 minutes. It takes pretty much everyone 2 minutes. So it's saved us quite literally hours of time. Everything's much more accurate, and we trust it. So that's kind of the workflow here. So how has it helped us? BrainChild Bio started completely from scratch. We had nothing. We showed up. We're like, what are we doing right now? So our very brief familiarity with LabKey allowed us to set up our inventory infrastructure immediately. This was actually the least of our concerns that we had moving forward. So this was like a huge weight off of our shoulders. We trusted LabKey, we knew what it could do, and we just moved forward. Furthermore, we did a lot of biological transfers of cell lines and plasmids from Seattle Children's to BrainChild Bio. This allowed us to easily track them and rename them. I cannot imagine what that process would have been like without that. Probably would have made some really, really big mistakes. We can say that they're mistake-free and they're tracked, and it's not a concern for us, which is a really big deal. Again, the implementation of sample batch functionality, it's critical for GLP process and any FDA audits and submissions and anything else that we might have to go through. You don't have to guess where things are coming from. You can have that confidence in what you're reporting. And obviously, we have the continued use of ELNs and workflow, and that's maintained high data and sample integrity and traceability like from the start. So again, I did this before, but I want to do a special shout out to Hannah. The improvement that I left Seattle Children's with has been excellent. I still work with them on training and that kind of stuff. They're always telling me how much better and how much easier it is. And then the setup of this for BrainChild Bio, it absolutely could not have happened without Hannah. Again, she mocked up the one for BrainChild Bio as well, saved me a ton of time. I could just say, great, sounds good. Trust you with it. If I have any comments or changes, we can work through it together. And it was an excellent customer experience. So, I think as someone mentioned previously, like sort of all these software lab management solutions move towards these all-in-one like assay data management and robust sample management solutions. Customer service, for me at least, is what separates them apart, right? Like there are always going to be factors added and features added, and everyone's going to kind of move in the same direction. But the trust and Hannah's expertise and availability this entire time has made it the smoothest process imaginable. So special shout out. So I can take any questions.
Awesome presentation, Doug. It looks like maybe there might be a question or two coming in. Feel free to put that answer the Q&A or chat for basically an implementation veteran at this point, Doug. I think that's kind of you might be the most knowledgeable. So maybe a couple questions from our team. And you touched on this a little bit, but it did sound like you sort of changed your approach between sort of what you had mocked up for Seattle Children's versus BrainChild Bio. Can you talk about kind of what drove that process mainly a little bit more?
Sure. So as I mentioned, like we had such a big database, both in terms of not like gigabyte size wise, but like so many different inputs. I think we had 13,000 cell lines and X amount of plasmid lines and all this other stuff. And like it's baggage. It generates baggage. So you kind of have to do this weird sort of melting together of, we want to improve the process, but we are kind of stuck with like the data that we have. For example, like generating batches for samples was something that we hadn't done, and it was something we wanted to do in the future, but we weren't going to get to it yet because our big concern at the time was really just getting rid of the old system and getting it into a new, more functional system. Also, we didn't have any batches before in any meaningful sense. So like we couldn't go back and like reassign those batches. So like when BrainChild Bio came along, it was like we could sort of ditch the baggage of having all of those samples and having to sort of work with that and say, how would we do this if we were starting a company from scratch, right? And we wanted to be more deliberate with kind of what we were tracking. We wanted to look back at our pitfalls and say like, what can we do here to make this whole process like easier? So a good example would be like, who made this cell line? What is this from? What batch is this? Where was it derived from? Like, how old is it? All of those things that were, I wouldn't say they weren't tracked, but like it was spotty, right? We wanted to say like, look, when someone comes up to me and says, what is this cell line? What's the history of this cell line? I would want to say to them, click on these like 2 buttons and you have a full sense of this, right? So that was like when we pivoted to like, okay, now we want to do batches right now. We want to set that up because this is, we have to generate all of these working banks for master banks that we had not previously, that we're transferring over. And yeah, it was just like the ability to kind of start fresh and not be tied down to data and like see a vision through more like, and like apply it right away. Yeah, that answer your question?
Yeah, it did. Thanks.
Okay.
And then you mentioned this as well, of kind of still staying connected to the group at Seattle Children's. Have you noticed any sort of like morale shift in the work now that people could do things like bulk import since the transition from the other system, or are there any sort of other unintended side effects you saw there in the team before you left?
Well, I'll say this, and I don't mean it in this tone, but like, no one has bothered me.
Yeah.
And I think that's a huge compliment to the software, right? Like I have most experience in the lab probably of the group that remains there. Certainly I was the onboarding export. Like I think it's an extreme compliment to the software itself, where I can implement it and like quite literally walk away like a month later and I just don't get questions on it. And I know that they're running things properly. Like I talked to the person that I trained and have moved on from there. Like I don't think there's a bigger compliment to software than that, right? So that's definitely been a big one. I didn't mention this. If people are still listening to me ramble, a very big thing if you are bringing the software or really any software, but with the software as well, is to write a manual for your workflow, like basic tasks, both within LabKey itself, but also like your specific workflow and how that's generated. It will save you personally a lot of time if you're the trainer. It'll make sure that things get done correctly. There's a ton of like capture tools out there that can help you with that. It's a lot of work up front, but like it's peace of mind for getting things done correctly. Like if you're in the middle of something in the lab and someone is like, how do I do this? It's like, read the manual I wrote you, please. And you can give them that manual. So that's a tip.
Totally agree. It's never the most fun part of it, but it certainly saves time.
Yeah, I won't lie. It's not glamorous at all. It sucks. But it's very, very worth it for sure.
Awesome. Okay, well, thanks so much, Doug. I really appreciate you kind of talking about all of your experience with Sample Manager kind of at both places. So,
Of course. Thank you.